The paper landed face down. That is where this story begins. Not with a speech, not with a ceremony, not with anyone standing at a podium saying that a young man had done something remarkable. It begins with a piece of paper landing face down on a desk, in a room that smelled like chalk dust, an old carpet, in a school that the city of Chicago had quietly decided was not worth saving on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October. The hand that placed it there belonged to Bernard Pruitt, 51 years old, 19 years at Westfield Academy. A man who had once believed that teaching was the most important thing a person could do with their life, and who still believed it somewhere beneath the fatigue the way you still believe in a fire after it has burned down to embers. Not gone, just buried, waiting perhaps for the right kind of air. He moved through the rows with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Face down, face down, face down. 24 desks, 24 papers, the manila folder growing lighter with each pass. He did not look at the names on the papers. He did not need to. After 19 years, the choreography of examination morning was muscle memory. You distributed, you sat, you waited, you collected, you marked, you moved on. The rhythm of it was almost meditative if you did not think too carefully about what the rhythm was in service of. He reached the second row from the back. He placed the last paper on the last desk. He walked back to the front of the room and sat down and opened the book he had brought and took a sip of his coffee and did not think about anything in particular. The coffee had already started going cold. It always did. The boy in the second row from the back turned the paper over. His name was Elijah Morrow. He was 15 years old. He was wearing a gray hoodie that had been washed so many times, the lettering across the chest had faded to almost nothing, the ghost of words that had once been legible. He had a mechanical pencil that he had owned for 2 years and kept in the front pocket of his backpack, wrapped in a small cloth so it would not get scratched. He had a blue pen as a backup. He had an eraser. He had everything he needed, which was more than most people in his life had understood about him. He turned the paper over and read the title. Advanced Mathematics, A-Level Further Pure, Year 13 examination paper. He read it again. He looked at the first question. Prove by induction that for all positive integers in the sum of squares from 1 to n equals n times n plus 1 times 2, n plus 1, divided by 6. He read the second question. Find the general solution of the differential equation dy over dx plus 2y equals e to the power of x. He read the third. Given that z equals 2 plus 3, I find the modulus and argument of z squared expressing the argument in radians to 3 decimal places. He sat with this for a moment. Not a long moment, a precise one. The kind of moment that has a particular quality of stillness, like the second before a diver leaves the board, when the decision has already been made and what remains is only the execution. Around him, 23 other students were already writing. The scratch of pens and pencils filled the room with the particular sound of an examination in progress. Focused, quiet, the sound of people doing what they had been prepared to do, working within the boundaries of what the system had arranged for them, moving through the familiar territory of a curriculum they had studied for months. Elijah looked at the paper in front of him. He looked at the students around him. He looked at Mr. Pruitt at the front of the room, book open, coffee at his elbow, not watching. He thought about raising his hand. He walked through the sequence in his mind with the same methodical attention he gave to mathematical problems. The hand going up, Mr. Pruitt looking over, the crossing of the room, the confusion registering on the teacher's face, the exchange of papers, the murmured explanation, the return to the front, and then everything resuming exactly as it had been arranged to be, as if the wrong paper had never landed on his desk, as if this moment had never happened at all, as if the ordinary machinery of the school day had simply continued without interruption. He sat with that sequence for approximately 4 seconds. Then Elijah Morrow picked up his pen and began to write. He did not hesitate. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. He did not ask for permission because he had understood for some time now that permission was not something this system was going to offer him, and that waiting for it was a form of surrender he could not afford. He simply began, and the room had no idea. To understand what happened next, you need to understand 2 things. You need to understand the school, and you need to understand the boy. Not separately, together, because neither one makes full sense without the other, And the story that connects them is not a story about exceptional talent arriving from nowhere. It is a story about what talent looks like when it has been growing in the dark for years, unwatered and unacknowledged, and what happens when light finally reaches it. Westfield Academy sat on the south side of Chicago like something the city had meant to come back for and then forgotten. It was a state secondary school. 3 stories of concrete and glass that had been modern in 1987 and was simply aging now, not gracefully, but the way underfunded things age with missing ceiling tiles and flickering fluorescent lights and a gymnasium floor that warped every winter and stayed warped until the following autumn, absorbing the cold and keeping it. The neighborhood around it had changed 4 times in the past 2 decades. Different storefronts, different demographics, different conversations happening on the same corners. The school had stayed the same hallways, the same institutional green paint in the stairwells, the same water fountain on the second floor that ran warm in summer and barely at all in winter. Some things become permanent not because anyone decided they should be, but because no one ever decided they should not be. 3 mathematics teachers had left in the past 2 years. One to a better funded school across the district drawn by smaller class sizes and newer equipment. One to a private tutoring company that paid twice the salary for a fraction of the emotional labor. One for reasons that were listed in the official paperwork as personal, which everyone understood to mean that the gap between what the job required and what the job provided had finally become impossible to close. 3 teachers in 2 years. 3 people who had decided each in their own way that the calculation no longer worked. The textbooks in the mathematics department were 6 editions out of date. This was not a small thing, the kind of deficiency that could be compensated for by a resourceful teacher working around the edges. In mathematics, 6 editions out of date meant missing entire branches of curriculum that the examination board had revised, restructured, and in some cases replaced entirely. It meant students arriving at standardized assessments having studied material that no longer mapped cleanly onto what they were being asked to demonstrate. It meant a systematic disadvantage baked into the furniture of the classroom, invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention to the specifics. The computer lab had 14 working computers for 400 students. There was a sign-up sheet on a clipboard outside the door. Reserved sessions were 30 minutes. You learned quickly to get there early and to not be late logging off because someone was always waiting behind you counting the minutes with the specific attention of a person who does not have enough of something and has learned to make every unit count. The computers were old enough that some of them took 3 minutes to start up, which meant that a 30-minute session was often a 27-minute session, and you made your peace with that or you did not, but either way, the clock did not stop. This was Westfield Academy. Not a bad school, not a cruel one, not a place where children were actively discouraged or deliberately harmed. A school that had been allocated less than it needed for long enough that the deficit had become structural, had become invisible, had become in the quiet accounting of the city's priorities acceptable, which is its own kind of harm, the harm of acceptance of the slow normalization of inadequacy until it stops registering as inadequacy and begins to register as simply the way things are. The city had not made a decision to abandon Westfield Academy. It had made 10,000 smaller decisions over 30 years, each one individually defensible, collectively devastating. Decisions about where to build and what to fund and which neighborhoods warranted investment and which could wait another budget cycle. And the waiting had become permanent, and the permanence had become normal, and the normal had become invisible. And inside the invisible, there were children. 400 of them on any given day, coming through the doors at 7:45 in the morning, sitting in the fluorescent-lit classrooms, opening the 6 editions out-of-date textbooks, learning what they were given to learn, being assessed by what they had been given, being prepared according to the best intentions of overextended teachers, working with inadequate resources for the lives that the school's collective imagination had decided were possible for them. Most of those children never knew that a ceiling existed. They moved through the school, through the years, through the assessments, and they did not feel the ceiling because the ceiling was not visible. It did not announce itself. It did not appear in any policy document or any teacher's lesson plan or any conversation between any administrator and any parent. It lived in assumption, in the median expectations that shaped every lesson, calibrated not to what was possible, but to what had historically been achieved in this building by students from this neighborhood under these conditions. in the questions that were asked and the questions that were not, in the slow, invisible accumulation of what was considered appropriate for a student from a school like this, in a neighborhood like this, with resources like these. Elijah Morrow had felt the ceiling since the middle of year 8. He had not had the language for it then. He was 13, and the language for systemic educational failure is not something 13-year-olds typically possess. What he had was the sensation of a room where the walls kept meeting him too soon, where he would reach what was being taught and then keep going in his own mind past the edge of the lesson into territory that the class would not reach for years or perhaps ever. And he would sit there in that territory alone and silent, waiting for something that did not come. Waiting for a question that was harder than the ones being asked. Waiting for someone to notice that he had finished and to hand him something more. Waiting for a door to open that no one in the building had thought to look for. He had not complained about this. He had not told his mother, not in terms she could have taken to the school and demanded something with. He had simply done what people do when the door they are standing in front of does not open. He had found another way in. The public library was 4 blocks from the apartment where he lived with his mother. He had held a library card since the age of 8, the card laminated and kept in the small pocket of his backpack, with the kind of care that people give to things they understand to be more valuable than they appear. By the time he was 13, he had exhausted every mathematics book on the shelves that he had not already read. Not skimmed, read, worked through, argued with on paper until he understood not just what the books were claiming, but why the claims were true, what stood beneath them, what held them up. He had spoken to the librarian, a quiet woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had worked at that branch for 20 years and who had developed over those 2 decades a precise ability to recognize the specific look of a person who had run out of road and needed more. She had seen it in graduate students the day before their dissertations were due. She had seen it in retired engineers who had come back to things they had not thought about in 40 years. She had seen it occasionally in children, though rarely at 13, and rarely with the particular focused quality that Elijah carried, the quality of someone who was not browsing but searching, who knew what he was looking for, even if he could not yet name it exactly. She had told him about the interlibrary loan system. You could request books from other libraries, from university collections, from institutions anywhere in the country. The network was large, and if a book existed and was in a library somewhere, there was a reasonable chance you could get it. It took time, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3, but they came. They arrived at the branch desk, and Mrs. Aldridge would call, and he would come in, and she would hand the book over with a quiet acknowledgement, not ceremony, not performance, just the recognition of one person by another, and he would carry it home and begin. The first book he requested through the system had come from a university in the Midwest. It arrived wrapped in brown paper, the cover worn smooth at the corners from years of handling the spine, reinforced with tape by someone before him who had also found it worth preserving, who had also understood that this particular object deserved protection. It was a university-level text on real analysis, the kind of book that first-year mathematics undergraduates read when they are being introduced to the rigorous foundations of calculus, the proof-based underpinning of everything they have previously taken on faith. The kind of book that assumes you already know everything taught in secondary school and is now asking you to understand not just how things work, but why they must work that way, what the logic is beneath the procedure, what makes the whole structure hold. Elijah read it in 11 days. He read it the way you read something that has been waiting for you, that fits the shape of a need you have been carrying around without being able to name. Not fast, carefully, with a pencil in his hand and a notebook open beside him. Going back when something did not sit right, working it through until it did. Refusing to move forward until he understood not just what the book was saying, but why it was saying it, what it was actually claiming about the structure of mathematical reality. The notebook was important, not a school notebook. He had bought it separately from the corner store 2 blocks from the apartment, 49 cents plain dark cover, 60 pages of unlined paper. He liked the unlined paper because mathematics does not respect lines. It goes where it goes, diagrams cut across ruled boundaries, and proofs require space in unexpected directions. He filled it. He bought another, then another. By the time he was 15 and sitting in the second row from the back with the wrong examination paper on his desk, he had 4 notebooks, 3 completely full, 1 half finished. In them was the entire architecture of what he had taught himself over 2 years of evenings and weekends and Saturday afternoons in the library carrel. Not transcriptions of textbooks. Not copied examples with filled-in variables. The working out, the struggle made visible, the places where he had gotten stuck, and the approaches he had tried that had not worked, and the moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, when the thing had opened and he had seen through to the other side. He had a graphing calculator his Uncle Devin had given him. Devin was his mother's younger brother, 12 years younger than Cecile, which made him 26 when Elijah was 15. He drove a delivery truck during the week and fixed cars on weekends in the parking lot behind his apartment building with the easy competence of someone who understands mechanical systems intuitively, who can hear what an engine is telling him and respond to it. He had a natural facility for numbers that had never been formally developed that expressed itself instead in an uncanny ability to calculate costs and margins in his head, to assess a deal before anyone else in the room had finished running the numbers on their phone, to know almost immediately whether something was going to work or whether it was not. He had seen something in Elijah when the boy was 9 years old. Elijah had been sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, working through something in a notebook, and Devin had come by with takeout and had sat down and set a problem for the boy as a joke, the kind of thing adults do with children they think are smart, expecting a good try and a near miss. Instead, Elijah had solved it in the time it took Devin to open his food, and had then explained a second method he had noticed, and had done both of these things with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had been solving problems like this for so long that they no longer presented themselves as challenges, but as conversations. Devin had not made a production of it. He was not a man who made productions of things. He had simply started paying closer attention to his nephew. 2 years later, when he replaced his old graphing calculator with a newer model, he had given the old one to Elijah without ceremony. Just handed it over. Said it still works fine. Said he thought Elijah might find a use for it. Elijah had found 17 uses for it within the first week, several of which Devin could not follow when they were explained to him, and which Devin found quietly remarkable for reasons he did not articulate but carried with him. This was what the school did not know. This was what the examination system did not know. This was what Bernard Pruitt, sitting at the front of the room with his book and his coffee going cold, did not know. As Elijah Morrow sat in the second row from the back and worked through a university entrance examination in complete and unhurried silence with the calm of someone who had been waiting 2 years for a question worth answering. You need to understand Cecile Morrow. Not because she is a secondary figure in this story. She is not. She is in many ways the reason the story is possible at all. The reason there was a boy capable of sitting in that room and doing what he did. The reason the notebooks existed. The reason the library card was used the way it was used. The reason the hunger was disciplined rather than scattered, focused rather than consumed. Cecile was 38 years old. She had grown up 10 miles from where she now lived in a neighborhood that had been demolished and rebuilt twice since her childhood, and that she no longer recognized when she drove through it. The landmarks of her memory had been replaced by structures that served different purposes for different people, and she found that she could pass through without grief, as long as she did not slow down and look too carefully at where particular things used to be. She had grown up in a household where money was the subject of every conversation, and also never discussed, because discussing it directly meant confronting the arithmetic, and the arithmetic, examined too closely, had a way of producing a particular kind of fear that was not useful on a Tuesday morning when you had obligations that could not be deferred. Her parents had worked, both of them, long hours at jobs that paid what they paid and did not pay more. There had been enough. Barely, carefully, strategically enough, which she understood now with adult eyes to be its own form of wealth, though not the kind that accumulates or opens doors. She had been good at mathematics, not good in the casual way the word is used, not good the way people mean when they say a child picks things up quickly. Good in the deeper way. Good in the way that means the subject has a claim on you, that it speaks in a register you can hear that other people cannot, that the structure underneath the symbols is something you perceive directly rather than reconstruct effortfully. Good in the way that makes a room feel larger when you are working well, when the logic is moving cleanly, and each step follows the last with the particular satisfaction of things being exactly as they must be. At 14, she had won a mathematics competition, a regional one run by a consortium of school districts in partnership with a local university drawing students from across the South Side. She had placed first in a field of 60 students from 12 schools. The competition had covered algebra geometry and introductory number theory, and she had finished with 17 minutes remaining and had used 12 of those minutes to check her work and 5 of them to sit and look at the window and feel briefly the specific elation of having done something well under conditions designed to make it difficult. The organizer, a retired professor named Dr. Whitmore, who had spent 40 years teaching mathematics at the university level and who spent his retirement doing what he wished he had done more of during his career, which was finding young people who were genuinely capable and making sure they knew it, had sought her out afterward. He had spoken to her for 20 minutes in the hallway outside the competition room. He had told her about programs, about opportunities at the university level for students who demonstrated unusual ability, about summer institutes and early entry tracks and pathways that existed specifically for students whose schools could not give them what their ability warranted. He had given her a card with his name and contact information and told her to call him in the spring when the application windows opened. She had kept the card for 2 years. She had taken it out of the drawer and looked at it perhaps 15 times over those 2 years. Not to do anything with it, just to look at it, to hold the possibility it represented for a few minutes before returning it to the drawer and returning to whatever the evening required. Then her mother had gotten sick. Not suddenly, not in the way that creates a clean before and after a date you can point to and say, everything changed here. Gradually. The way water stops running when the source dries up, not all at once, but progressively, the pressure dropping by degrees, until one day you turn the tap and nothing comes. First, the fatigue that her mother attributed to the long shifts and the seasons changing. Then the appointments that multiplied. Then the diagnoses that required their own appointments and their own adjustments. Then the weeks when someone had to be home after school, when the younger siblings had to be collected and fed and helped with their own work and put to bed, when the ordinary maintenance of a family's daily life had to be performed by whoever was available and capable and old enough to be trusted with it. Cecile was available, she was capable, she was old enough. She had not dropped out of school. She had not stopped studying or stopped caring about the studying. She had simply redirected the available energy toward what was immediately necessary, the way water redirects around an obstacle, not because it has decided to change course, but because the obstacle is there and the water has to go somewhere. The professor's card stayed in the drawer. The spring came and the application windows opened, and she did not call. She told herself she would call the following spring when things had stabilized. Things did not stabilize in the way she had hoped. The following spring she did not call either, and then the card was gone from the drawer. She did not know exactly when it had left, could not identify the day or the decision, only the absence when she went looking for it one afternoon and found only the back of the drawer and a receipt from somewhere she no longer remembered going. She had stood at the open drawer for a long moment, then she had closed it and gone to make dinner. She had never told Elijah any of this. She had thought about it, had constructed the conversation in her mind many times sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the evenings holding the words ready. I was good at this too. I had something. Here is what happened to it. But every time she approached the actual telling, she felt the weight of what the story might become in his understanding. The way it could settle on him as obligation, as a debt he owed on her behalf, as a burden shaped like opportunity. She had decided that what she could give him was not her story. What she could give him was her attention, full, genuine, nightly attention to his story, his learning, his progress, his questions, his next step. Every evening without exception, unless one of them was genuinely ill, Cecile Morrow sat across from her son and asked him what he had learned that day. She asked it the way she meant it, not as a pleasantry designed to signal parental engagement before moving on to the next item on the evening's agenda, but as a real question, the most important question of the day, the one she had been saving her attention for since she walked through the door. She listened to the answer. She asked follow-up questions that showed she had heard not just what he said tonight, but what he had said last week and the week before, that she was tracking the accumulation of it, the shape of the learning over time. Even when the specific content had moved into territory she could not independently verify. She did not pretend to understand things she did not understand. She asked from the edge of her own comprehension the real questions that a person standing at the edge of their understanding asks, not the performed questions of someone managing a conversation, but the genuine questions of someone trying to follow as far as they can. In the past year, the content had moved far past what she could follow in any technical sense. The mathematics had gone somewhere she could not go. She knew this. He knew she knew this. They had found without discussing it a way to continue the ritual across the distance. He would explain what he was working on in the translated language of analogy and structure, finding the shapes of things that could cross the gap between where he was and where she was. She would listen and track those shapes and ask about them the way you ask about the emotional logic of something you cannot follow. Technically what it feels like, what it opens up where it is trying to go. He had told her about the calculus, not the machinery of it, but the meaning of it. The way it was a language for describing change, for finding the rate beneath the curve, for speaking precisely about things that were in motion. She had nodded and said it sounded like a tool she would have wanted when she was working the early shift and trying to calculate whether the numbers added up to both the electric bill and the groceries, or whether one of them had to wait another week. He had laughed. She had let him laugh. Then she had asked what he was going to do next with it. That was the question she always asked. Not what have you done, what are you going to do next? As if the learning were always a road that kept extending, always a direction rather than a destination. As if stopping were not something she was willing to entertain as a conclusion. He had been trying to live up to that question every day for 2 years. It had shaped the work more than the books had. The books gave him the content. The question gave him the momentum. Bernard Pruitt had been a good teacher once. He said this to himself sometimes in the car on the way home, or sitting at his desk in the empty classroom after the last period, not with bitterness, but with the precision of a man doing an honest accounting of himself. Not self-pity, inventory. He had been good, genuinely. He had been the kind of teacher who changed things for students whose class some of them remembered years later, and mentioned when the subject came up, who had made the mathematics feel like something worth caring about rather than something to be endured. He had come to Westfield Academy 19 years ago with a master's degree in mathematics from a state university and a genuine love of the subject that had survived the credential process intact and was still at 32 something he carried with pleasure. He had believed in what he was doing with the kind of belief that makes a person wake up in the morning with a sense of purpose, which is rarer than it should be and more valuable than most accounting systems recognize. He had believed that showing a child the structure of a quadratic equation was not just teaching algebra. It was showing them that the world had structure, that underneath the apparent chaos of numbers and unknowns, there was order, logical and beautiful and accessible, that the feeling of a problem resolving into its solution was a feeling available to anyone willing to follow the logic, regardless of where they had come from, or what had been decided about them before they walked through the door. He had believed this. He still believed it somewhere under everything that had accumulated on top of it. The years had not destroyed the belief. They had buried it under other things the way sediment buries things not through intention, but through accumulation layer by layer, each layer individually thin and almost weightless, collectively sufficient to put something a long way down. Under the 3 colleagues who had left in 2 years and whose classes he had absorbed into his schedule on a temporary basis that had become indefinitely permanent. Under the marking, which was relentless and which consumed the evenings he had once used for other things. Under the meetings that produced documentation rather than decisions. Under the specific grinding exhaustion of trying to teach 30 students in a room designed for 24 with materials that did not match the assessment towards standards that kept shifting while the resources for reaching them stayed exactly still. He had noticed Elijah Morrow in year 7. You notice things that are brighter than the room they are in. Not because you are looking for them, because the eye responds to contrast involuntarily before the conscious mind has decided to pay attention. Elijah had been that kind of bright, the kind you see before you decide to see it. He had seen the boy finish the exercises early, had seen the way he would sit afterward, not restless, not looking for a distraction, not doing the thing that many students do when they finish early, which is to look around to see who is watching or to perform the appearance of continued effort. Elijah sat with a different quality of stillness. The stillness of someone still thinking, still working, whose external activity had stopped while the internal activity continued and went somewhere else. Pruitt had thought sharp kid. He had given him an A and moved on. This was not a decision in the way that decisions announce themselves. It was a non-decision, a default. The path of least resistance in a system that had no mechanism for anything else, no protocol, no pathway, no number to call and say I have a student here who has finished what I can give him and needs something I do not have. What do we do? There was the syllabus, there were the assessments, there were the grades, and then there was the next class, and the one after that, and the 37 papers waiting on the weekend, and the meeting on Thursday that would run until 5 and resolve nothing, and the non-decision was made the way 10,000 non-decisions are made in institutions everywhere by the simple absence of a mechanism for any other choice. He had marked Elijah's work for 3 years. He had given him A grades without exception. He had written comments at the top of the pages. Excellent work. Strong reasoning. Well demonstrated. He had meant these things. They were not empty praise, but they were also not enough. They were the floor, not the ceiling. They confirmed what had already been done without pointing toward what had not yet been attempted. He had not sat down beside Elijah Morrow in 3 years and asked, "What do you actually know? How far have you actually gone? What are you doing in the hours that are not these hours in the notebooks you carry in your backpack and never open in class in the library sessions that Mrs. Aldridge at the branch 4 blocks from the school could have described in detail had anyone thought to ask her?" He had not asked. He had looked at the grades and the comments he had written and moved on, and the assumption had operated quietly and continuously beneath the surface of every lesson, every assessment, every interaction, drawing the boundaries of what was considered possible without ever stating those boundaries in language that could be examined or challenged. This was not cruelty. That was the important thing to hold alongside everything else. It was not malice. It was not even negligence in the deliberate sense. It was something quieter and in some ways more damaging than either of those things, because at least cruelty and deliberate negligence can be named and confronted. What Pruitt had practiced for 3 years was the ordinary operation of assumption, the invisible management of expectations, according to a map that had been drawn long before Elijah Morrow arrived, and that no one in the building had thought to question because everyone in the building was operating from the same map. He was thinking about none of this on the morning of the examination. He was thinking about the coffee which had already gone cold. He was thinking about the staff meeting at 4 o'clock. He was thinking about the 37 papers he needed to mark before Monday. He was not thinking about the boy in the second row from the back. He was not thinking about the paper on that boy's desk. He was not thinking about what was happening quietly without announcement, without any of the signals that a system trained to notice the ordinary had been taught to look for in the second row from the back, where a 15-year-old was doing something the room had no framework to understand. At the 40-minute mark, Pruitt stood from his desk and began his supervisory circuit. He did this every examination twice, once at 40 minutes and once at 70. He walked the rows. He checked that students were working. He checked that no unauthorized materials were visible. He checked that everything was proceeding as arranged. He walked the first row, then the second, then the third. He reached the second row from the back and walked along it and reached the desk of Elijah Morrow and looked down. He stopped. On the desk was a paper. On the paper were answers. Answers to questions that Pruitt recognized not because he had written them, but because he had once known this content well, had once taught it at a different school to older students in a different chapter of his career before Westfield, before the accumulation had buried the belief this far down. He stood there. He read the first answer. He read the second. He looked at the third. The third question asked for the modulus and argument of a complex number squared. It was not difficult by year 13 standards, but it required fluency with a notation system and a set of concepts that were not taught anywhere in the year 10 syllabus. The answer was correct. The working was clean. The steps were shown not because the question required it, but because the student had chosen to show them. Because showing the steps was how this particular mind worked, how it maintained the chain of reasoning without losing a link, how it caught its own errors before they could propagate. Pruitt read the answer a second time. Then he looked at the student. Elijah was writing, not looking up, not monitoring the teacher's reaction from the corner of his eye, not performing, just working in the way that people work when the work is the thing, when there is no audience relevant enough to pull the attention away from the page. Pruitt looked at the title at the top of the paper. Advanced Mathematics, A-Level Further Pure, Year 13 Examination Paper. He understood what had happened. He understood the administrative error the paper shuffled incorrectly in the folder, the year 13 paper placed by accident into the year 10 distribution. He understood the error completely. What he did not yet understand was the student. he said quietly so as not to disturb the 23 others. Elijah. The boy looked up, not startled, not guilty, not performing innocence, just present, waiting. That's not your paper, Pruitt said. I know, Elijah said. He said it the way you say a thing that requires no elaboration. Not defensive, not apologetic, not performative. Just the statement of a fact by someone who has already processed the situation, arrived at a position, and has no plans to move from it. Pruitt looked at the paper. He looked at the answers. He looked at the boy. He thought about taking the paper and replacing it with the Year 10 paper. The sensible option. The administratively correct one. The option that preserved the integrity of the process and introduced no complications and left everything exactly as it had been arranged to be. He thought about this for a moment that was longer than it appeared from the outside. Then he placed the Year 13 paper back on the desk. Finish it, he said. 2 words. Quiet. No explanation. He walked back to the front of the room and sat down at his desk and did not open his book, did not lift his coffee, did not think about the staff meeting or the 37 papers. He watched Elijah Morrow pick up his pen, and he watched him write. For the next 50 minutes, Bernard Pruitt sat at the front of the room and did something he had not done in longer than he could precisely remember. He paid full attention, not to the class as an administrative unit requiring supervision, to one student, to the movement of the pen, to the pauses which were not the pauses of confusion or uncertainty, but the pauses of assembly, the specific productive stillness of a mind building something before committing it to paper. To the quality of the concentration, which was different from the concentration in the rest of the room, different not in kind, but in depth, the way a river and a puddle are both water but are not the same thing. He watched, and somewhere beneath the fatigue, beneath the accumulated weight of 19 years in a building that had taken more than it had returned, something shifted. Not open, not yet, but moved. The way something frozen begins to move when warmth finds it, not all at once, not dramatically, but the first indication that the state is not permanent, that the possibility of change has not been exhausted. He did not know yet what he was watching. He suspected that it was something he had not seen before in 19 years. He suspected that the paper, when he finally read it fully, was going to require him to sit with a truth that he had been avoiding for 3 years without knowing he was avoiding it. He sat at his desk. He watched the boy write. The room was quiet around them. 23 students working through a familiar examination. One student working through something else entirely. The clock marking the minutes with its small mechanical patience, indifferent to the significance of what was happening beneath it. The October light coming through the windows at the angle it comes at that hour in Chicago Flat, in particular, the light of a morning that does not yet know whether it will be remembered. 47 minutes remained. 11 questions. Elijah Morrow turned to question 4 and wrote without hesitation. The examination ended at 10:45. The clock moved from 10:44 to 10:45, the way it moved between every other pair of minutes, with the same mechanical indifference to consequence. But Pruitt stood and said quietly, "Pens down, please." And the room responded the way it always responded, with the collective exhale of people releasing something. They have been holding the sounds of pencil cases closing, and chairs shifting, and bags being lifted, and the general reorganization of 23 bodies preparing to return to the rest of the day. 23. Pruitt collected the papers row by row. He thanked the students as they filed out. He said, "See you Thursday" to the girl near the door who asked about the next lesson. He waited until the last footstep had faded in the corridor and the room had settled into the silence of a space just emptied, still holding the warmth of the people who had been in it, the chalk dust and the October light unchanged by their departure. Then he looked at the desk in the second row from the back. Elijah Morrow had not moved. He sat with his bag on his lap and his hands folded on top of it, waiting in the way that someone waits when they know something is coming and have decided to meet it directly rather than deflect it. He was not nervous. He was not performing calm. He simply was calm with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have done the work and know they have done it and are now waiting for the world to catch up. On the desk in front of him were 2 papers. The Year 10 paper. Correct answers throughout. Completed in 14 minutes. Checked twice. Set to one side with the care of something that had served its purpose and could be set down. And beside it, the Year 13 paper. 12 questions. Everyone answered. Every step shown. 90 minutes of work by a 15-year-old who had never been given access to a single piece of the curriculum it covered, who had come to it entirely on his own through library books, and borrowed time and the specific disciplined hunger of someone who understands that knowledge is the only distance between where they are and where they are trying to go. Pruitt walked to the desk. He stood for a moment, not yet sitting, looking at the two papers with the expression of a man who is still assembling what he is seeing into something his mind can hold, who is waiting for the meaning of a fact to catch up to the fact itself. Then he pulled the neighboring chair over and sat down. He placed both papers between them. He was quiet. Then he said, "How long have you been able to do this?" Not quite a question. The flatness of a statement made by someone who already suspects that the answer will be larger than they are ready for. Elijah looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for longer than the person across from him realizes. No performance in it, no resentment visible on the surface, though what lay beneath the surface was its own complicated geography that Elijah had already mapped and made his peace with. The calculus, he said. About a year. The complex numbers, 8 months. The statistics took longer. The proof techniques I started in year 8. Year 8. Elijah nodded once. Pruitt looked down at the year 13 paper. He read the answer to the third question again. The working, the notation. The result expressed exactly as the mark scheme would want it, not because Elijah had access to the mark scheme, but because a mind that understood the mathematics understood also what a complete answer required. "Where did you learn it?" Pruitt said. "Library books, some things online. There was a university textbook I requested through the interlibrary loan system. It came from a school in the Midwest." Pruitt absorbed this. The interlibrary loan system. A 15-year-old navigating the interlibrary loan system to request university mathematics texts. Reading them, working through them in 49-cent notebooks, filing what he learned in a private architecture of understanding that the school had never seen and never asked about. Sitting in year 10 classes for 2 years, operating at a level so far below what he was capable of that the word gap did not adequately describe the distance. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Elijah looked at him. He did not answer immediately. He let the question exist between them for a moment, giving it the time it deserved, because the honest answer required a precision he wanted to get right. Then he said, "Would you have believed me?" The question settled in the room with the weight of something that has been true for a long time and is being said aloud for the first time. Pruitt opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the papers on the desk. He looked at the window. He looked at the October light coming through it, the same light that had been there all morning, patient and indifferent and unchanged. He did not answer, because the honest answer was no. If Elijah Morrow had stood in his classroom doorway at the beginning of year 8 and said, "I have taught myself A-level further mathematics," Pruitt would not have believed it. He would have heard it as the bravado of a bright student who had skimmed the surface of something and mistaken the surface for the whole. He would have nodded with the practiced warmth of a teacher managing a student's self-image. He would have said something encouraging and moved on. He knew this about himself with the complete uncomfortable certainty of a man who has been forced to look at something he would have preferred not to examine. He turned to the last question. Question 12. 20 marks. The highest point value on the paper. Designed to separate the strong from the very strong. A proof in coordinate geometry requiring 3 separate concepts, each one dependent on the preceding one, connected in a chain of logic with no obvious entry point, no clear place to begin that announced itself as the right beginning. The question that most year 13 students found hardest. The question some of them left blank. He read Elijah's answer. He read the entry point. Instead of approaching the coordinate geometry directly, Elijah had drawn a connection to a result in vector algebra, a result that Pruitt did not immediately recognize. A result that was not in the year 13 syllabus, not in any syllabus Pruitt had taught in 19 years of secondary education. He read the proof from the vector algebra result to the coordinate geometry conclusion. He followed every step. Each one followed from the last with the clean necessity of something that is simply true, that could not be otherwise, that has the quality all good proofs have of seeming once seen to have always been inevitable. He said, "This connection. The vector algebra result. This isn't in any textbook I've seen." "I worked it out myself," Elijah said. The longest silence of the entire morning fell between them. Pruitt put his hand flat on the paper. Not dramatically. The way you put your hand on something to confirm that it exists, that it has physical substance, that you are not imagining it. He said, "I'm sorry." Elijah looked at him. "I've been teaching you below your level for 2 years. I didn't know. But I also didn't ask." He paused. "I should have asked." It was not a performance. There was no managing of it, no shaping of the apology for effect. It was a man saying a true thing to a student he had failed to see, carrying the specific weight of someone who understands exactly what the failure cost and understands also that the cost cannot be recovered, only acknowledged. And acknowledged with the full awareness of what acknowledgement means when it comes this late. Elijah was 15 years old. He sat across from this man and considered the apology with the same steady attention he gave everything. He understood that Bernard Pruitt was a tired man who had operated for a long time inside a system that made noticing difficult and moving on easy. He understood that the failure was real and the apology was real, and both things could be true simultaneously, that a person could fail you genuinely and be genuinely sorry and have genuinely meant no harm, and that holding all of these things at once was not a contradiction, but simply the shape of the world when you looked at it clearly enough. He had burned through the anger 18 months earlier. A Saturday afternoon in the library carrel, a topology problem that had resisted him for 4 days. And in the moment of finally cracking it, a sudden complete clarity that no one was coming. That no teacher was going to arrive at the carrel door and say they had heard about a student working through graduate-level mathematics alone at 13 and had come to help. That the path forward was the one he was already on. He had sat with the anger for 20 minutes precisely and without denial, and then had returned to the work. Because the anger was not useful in the way the work was useful, and he had always been very clear about which things deserved his time. "What comes next?" he said. Pruitt looked at the paper, then at the boy. "Now I make some phone calls," he said. The phone calls were not simple. Nothing that followed was simple or fast or proceeded in the clean line that this moment might seem to promise. Because systems do not move in clean lines. They move the way large, complicated things move, with friction and inertia, and the particular resistance of structures that were not built for situations like this one, and that respond to the unexpected by first determining whether it is a problem before they consider whether it is an opportunity. Pruitt went to the principal that afternoon. Walter Odom had been at Westfield for 6 years. He was not a bad administrator. He was a careful one, which in an under-resourced school operating in a district with a history of liability exposure meant he had become very good at identifying how unusual situations could become institutional problems before he could identify how they might become institutional successes. It was not a character flaw. It was a professional adaptation to conditions that rewarded caution over initiative. His first response to the story of Elijah Morrow and the wrong examination paper was a careful series of questions about the chain of custody of the examination materials, about whether protocols had been breached, about what the district board would require, about the legal exposure for a school that had administered the wrong paper to a student. Pruitt listened. He understood that Odom was not asking the wrong questions. He was asking the only questions his position and his experience had equipped him to ask first. But they were not the right questions, he said. Walter. The student completed the paper. All 12 questions, including the final question, which he solved using a method I have never seen in any curriculum I have taught. Odom looked at him. "He's 15, Pruitt said. A pause. Odom said, "We'll need him to sit the year 10 paper under proper conditions. For the official record." This was the first obstacle. Not malicious, not designed to erase what Elijah had done, designed to protect the institution from the appearance of an invalid assessment. From the documentation standpoint, the Year 10 examination had not been properly conducted. For every official purpose, the district recognized Elijah Morrow had not yet sat his Year 10 mathematics examination. He would need to do so again, formally, correctly. Pruitt understood the logic. He also understood what it meant. The institution's first formal response to a 15-year-old completing a university entrance examination was to ask him to demonstrate that he could pass the Year 10 test. He went back to his classroom. He opened his filing cabinet and retrieved 3 years of Elijah's marked work. Year 7, Year 8, Year 9. He sat and read them not as an assessor, but as the mathematician he had once been before the accumulation, before the narrowing. He read the questions and the answers. He read the methods chosen. He read the occasional notation that did not match what he had taught because it came from somewhere beyond what he had taught. He read the elegant economy of solutions that did not look like memorized procedures, but like genuine understanding finding its own shortest path. The signs had been there from the beginning, in every year, in every piece of work. He had marked the pages, written the comments, moved on. He put the papers back in the folder and picked up the phone. The call to the district office produced a meeting. The meeting produced a formal assessment referral. The referral produced a scheduled evaluation with a district mathematics specialist arranged for 3 weeks from the date of the original examination. In the meantime, the story moved. These things always move. By the end of the day of the examination, students in Elijah's class knew that something had happened, though the specifics were various and not all accurate. By the following morning, the story had the embellishments that stories acquire when they travel without guidance. By the end of the week, a parent had called the district office. On the 17th day after the examination, the local news ran a 90-second segment. No name. Privacy rules prevented that. But the outline was there. A student at a Southside school. A wrong paper. A 15-year-old. A completed year 13 examination. The segment produced 43 calls to the district office the following morning. This was not what moved the system forward. What moved it was Pruitt. Not dramatically. He did not make speeches or issue ultimatums. He appeared consistently at every meeting with the 2 papers and the 3 years of assessed work and the specific patient persistence of a man who understood that he had failed this student for 3 years and was not going to allow the system's inertia to extend that failure by a single unnecessary week. He said in every meeting to every administrator who looked at the situation and saw liability first, "Look at the paper. Just look at the paper." Eventually they looked. On the 21st day, the scanned pages of Elijah Morrow's completed Year 13 mathematics paper were sent to the Department of Mathematics at the University of Chicago. Attention Dr. Sandra Okafor. The cover letter was written by Pruitt himself at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, revised 4 times, stripped of everything that overstated or performed or asked for anything beyond. Look at this work and tell us what you are seeing. On the 21st day and the weeks between the examination and what would come next, Elijah sat his formal Year 10 re-examination under proper conditions. He completed it in 11 minutes, 3 minutes faster than the first time because he was not managing a second paper alongside it. He checked his work once, set down the pen. He called his uncle Devin from the parking lot afterward. Devin answered on the third ring background noise of the truck and traffic and the radio playing something with a steady beat. Elijah told him what had happened. Not everything. The shape of it. The examination, the wrong paper, the way it was moving through the system now. Devin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did the right thing, staying quiet and doing the work." Elijah said, "I wasn't being strategic." Devin said, "I know. That's why it was right." They talked for 5 minutes. Devin asked what the next step was. Elijah said he did not know exactly, but that it was moving. Devin said good, and that he was proud, and that the calculator had clearly been worth something. Elijah laughed. Devin laughed. The traffic continued in the background. After he hung up, Elijah stood in the parking lot for a moment. The day was overcast, the particular flat gray of a Chicago October afternoon that has decided it has given enough light for one day and is conserving for tomorrow. He put his phone in his pocket. He adjusted the strap of his backpack. He thought about what came next. He did not know exactly. He knew there were processes, meetings and assessments and channels that were not designed for situations like his. He knew those things took time. He knew that the system moved at its own pace for its own reasons, and that the most useful thing he could do was continue to do what he had always done, which was work and wait and not mistake the waiting for the answer. He walked to the library. He had 22 minutes left on his reserved session. He used them. Dr. Sandra Okafor received the scanned pages on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after the examination. She was 53 years old. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a high school biology teacher and a civil rights attorney, in a household where intellectual rigor was the water you swam in, where the question at the end of dinner was not "How was your day?" but "What did you learn today that you did not know this morning?" She had earned her doctorate in pure mathematics from MIT and had spent the first decade of her career in research, producing work that her colleagues respected and that she found genuinely absorbing before discovering that what she cared about most was not her own mathematical work, but the question that lay alongside it. Why did certain kinds of mathematical talent go systematically undetected in the American educational system? And what could be done about the systematic nature of the failure? This had become her work, the identification of mathematical ability in students from under-resourced communities. The mechanisms by which schools signaled to certain students through 1,000 small and invisible means that their potential had a ceiling. The ways that assumption operating through the ordinary processes of education shaped not just what students were taught, but what they came to believe about themselves. She had spent 15 years on this. She had seen genuine precocity before. She had worked with students who were exceptional by any measure. She had developed a precise and calibrated sense of what genuine, unusual mathematical ability looked like, as opposed to narrowly drilled facility. The distinction between a student who had been intensively prepared and could reproduce correct answers, and a student who had genuinely internalized the structure of the mathematics and could move through it with the freedom that comes only from real understanding. She opened the email. She read Pruitt's cover letter, which was careful and plain, and asked for nothing except an honest assessment. She downloaded the scanned pages. She read the year 13 paper from question 1 through question 11. She read it with the attention she gave everything fully, without allowing familiarity with the material to let her move faster than the argument warranted. Then she reached question 12. She read Elijah's answer. She read it again. She looked at the vector algebra result at the entry point of the proof. She recognized it, not from any curriculum, not from any teaching she had done or received, from a paper, a narrow circulation journal paper published 3 years earlier by a researcher at a university in the UK who had derived this result as a lemma inside a much larger proof about geometric structures. The paper had been read by a small number of people working in specialized areas. It was not widely known. It was not taught anywhere at any level. Elijah Morrow had derived it independently, at 15, in a public school on the south side of Chicago, using library books and a secondhand graphing calculator and 49-cent notebooks. He had not known the result existed. He had found it the way results are found, the first time they are found, by following the logic past the edge of the known territory, past the maps into the space where you build the road as you go. She sat at her desk for a moment looking at the scanned page, at the handwriting of a 15-year-old working through a result that a credentialed researcher had published in a professional journal 3 years before. Then she picked up the phone and called Gerald Hayward. Hayward was 61 years old, a specialist in algebraic geometry who had spent 30 years at the university and who had the particular quality of intellectual honesty that allows someone to be genuinely surprised by things, to encounter something that does not fit their expectations and respond with curiosity rather than defense. He was also, which was rarer than it should be, among people who assess talent for a living entirely without condescension. "Sandra," he said, "I need you to look at something." He looked at it. He was quiet for longer than she had expected. Then he said, "How old did you say?" 15, she said. Another silence. He said the approach on the final question. "Where did he learn this?" "He didn't learn it," she said. "He made it." The silence that followed was the silence of a man recalibrating, of someone adjusting the scale of their expectations to accommodate a data point that does not fit the existing scale. Then Hayward said, "I want to meet him." 3 weeks after the examination on a Thursday evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his mother. Cecile was still in her work clothes from the hospital shift, not yet changed, not yet fully home, in the way that the mind sometimes takes longer to arrive than the body. She was holding a cup of tea that had cooled to lukewarm while she listened. The kitchen light above them was incandescent warm and slightly tired, the light of a room that has held many evenings. She asked, as she always asked, "Tell me what you learned today." He told her about the formal re-examination, about the 11 minutes, about the district specialist who had administered it and whose expression had done something complicated when Elijah handed in the paper before anyone expected, about Pruitt's calls and the process moving slowly through channels that had not been designed for situations like his. She listened. She asked about the specialist, about what had been said. She tracked the shape of it. Then she said, "Are you scared?" He thought about it. Not the performance of consideration, but the real kind. "No," he said. He paused. "Maybe I should be." She said, "Why would you be scared?" He said, "Because it's bigger than anything I planned for. I wasn't planning for any of this. I was just working." She was quiet for a moment. The lukewarm tea, the warm light. She said, "That's exactly right, Elijah. You were just working. Everything else is just people catching up to what you already did." He looked at her. He had always been able to read the different qualities of her silences, the empty ones and the full ones, the tired ones and the thinking ones, and the ones where she was holding something she was not yet ready to say. This one was the last kind. He said, "Mom, were you ever good at math?" The quality of the silence changed. She set the cup down, she looked at it, then she looked at him. And for the first time she told him. The competition, the regional prize, the 60 students from 12 schools and the first place finish she had carried home on a Tuesday afternoon in March and shown to her mother, who had held the certificate with both hands in the voice she used when ordinary language was not sufficient. The retired professor who had sought her out afterward and spoken to her for 20 minutes about programs and pathways and what might be available to a student with her ability. The card he had given her. She had kept it for 2 years, she said. She had not looked at it for the last year. She kept it, just knew it was there. And then one day went to the drawer for something else, and the card was gone. And she did not know when it had left, and could not remember the decision, and had stood at the open drawer for a long moment before closing it and going to make dinner. The illness, the gradual withdrawal, the narrowing. She had not told him because she had not wanted him carrying the weight of her unlived life alongside his own. She had decided that what she could give him was not her story. What she could give him was her attention. But tonight, she said, looking at him across the table in the warm light, "Tonight, you are old enough. Tonight, it is not a weight. It is just the truth. You're finishing something I never got to start," she said. "Not as obligation, not as debt. As a fact finally spoken lighter for having been said than it had been in all the years of being kept." He understood the way he understood the mathematics all the way down to the structure of it, what she had done. He understood that she had looked at the inheritance she could offer and had decided deliberately that this particular piece of her story would not become part of his load. He had been carrying it anyway without knowing its shape, only feeling the weight of something unspoken that lived in the evenings and the question she asked and the way she listened. He said, "I know what you gave me instead." She looked at him. He said, "Every night." The question, all those years of asking. She said, "It was the least I could do." He shook his head. "It was not the least," he said. "It was the most." They sat together for another hour. The city moved through its evening outside. Traffic, voices, the layered sound of a place that does not stop because one conversation inside it has arrived somewhere important. In the weeks ahead, Elijah Morrow would take 2 buses to the University of Chicago and sit across from Dr. Sandra Okafor and her colleagues and answer questions for 40 minutes, and then stand at a whiteboard for 8 minutes and produce a result that would make a specialist in algebraic geometry sit very still. In 8 months, he would receive a full scholarship to the university's early entry program. In 12 months, he would sit his A-level further mathematics examination alongside students 2 years older than him. None of that had happened yet. Right now, there was only the kitchen and the light and his mother across the table and the story she had finally told and the story they were still inside together, the one that had been running since he was 8 years old, with a library card and a hunger that the school could not name and the city could not see, and only she had known how to meet every evening with a question and the full weight of her attention. "Tell me what you learned today." He had learned so many things. He was only beginning to understand how many more were waiting. The University of Chicago sat on the edge of Hyde Park like a different country. Elijah had passed through this neighborhood before on the bus, watching through the window, as the Gothic stone buildings moved past the wide quadrangles, the students crossing between structures with the particular ease of people who have never had to calculate whether they belong somewhere, who move through space as if it were built for them because in the most direct sense it was. He had observed it the way you observe something through glass, present but separated, real but not yet requiring a response. Now he was walking into it. He was wearing his school uniform. He had stood at the narrow closet in his bedroom the night before and looked honestly at what he owned running the inventory without sentiment. He did not own a suit. He did not own a blazer that was not his school blazer. He owned jeans and hoodies and the uniform was clean and had been pressed and communicated at minimum that he understood the meeting was serious. Cecile had pressed it the night before without being asked. He had come out of the bathroom to find it hanging on the back of his door, the creases sharp, the collar sitting correctly. She had not made a production of it. She had simply done it and gone back to the kitchen, and he had stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment before going to bed. He took 2 buses. The first ran 4 minutes late, compressing his window at the transfer stop from 11 minutes to 7. He made the second bus. He arrived on time, not early. He spent the second ride in the specific stillness of someone who has decided that the outcome of the next several hours is not something he can influence from a seat on a bus, and has therefore released it and is now simply watching the city move past the window. Block by block, neighborhood giving way to neighborhood, the South Side transitioning into Hyde Park with the gradual shift that cities make when the money distribution changes. The mathematics building was stone older than anything in his neighborhood by at least 60 years, with high windows and wooden doors whose brass handles had been worn smooth by decades of hands. He pushed through them and found the building directory and located the seminar room on the 3rd floor and climbed 2 flights of stairs and stood outside the door. He was not steadying himself. He was not performing composure for an imagined audience. He was simply in the brief space between not having started and having started, taking a moment in that space because it existed and would not exist again. Then he opened the door. There were 3 of them at the rectangular table. Dr. Sandra Okafor sat at the center. She was compact with close-cut hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a great deal of time thinking, for whom being in a room with another person is an act of genuine attention rather than something performed for the social record. She stood when he entered and shook his hand and said she was glad he had come, and he believed her because it was not the glad of courtesy, but the glad of someone who has been waiting for something and has now seen it arrive. To her left sat Professor Gerald Hayward, perhaps 60, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone for whom the physical world is a secondary concern, already dressed and already elsewhere in his mind. He had a legal pad covered in handwriting and was looking at Elijah with the frank, open curiosity of a man who sees something interesting and makes no effort to conceal it. To Okafor's right was a faculty member named Dr. Marcus Webb, whose field was geometric analysis, and who had a copy of Elijah's Year 13 paper in front of him, annotated carefully in 2 colors. Elijah sat across from them. Okafor said, "We've read your paper carefully. All of us. We have specific questions, but before we get to the mathematics, I want to ask you something simpler." She paused. "How did you learn what you know?" He told them. The library card, Mrs. Aldridge and the interlibrary loan system, the books arriving wrapped in brown paper from universities he had never seen. The 49-cent notebooks, 4 of them, the working out rather than the transcription. His Uncle Devin's graphing calculator. The Saturday afternoons in the library corral with the reserve session counting down and the problem still open on the page and the decision every time to come back the next day. He told them about the topology problem that had taken 4 days. He told them about the afternoon the foundations of calculus had clicked open. Not the procedures, but the reasons, the why beneath the how, the logical structure that made limits, not a trick, but a truth. And how he had sat very still for about 10 minutes afterward because the landscape had rearranged itself and needed time to settle into its new configuration. Hayward wrote on his legal pad. Webb read and reread something on the annotated page. Then Okafor said, "Tell us about question 12. He told them. The 3 minutes of stillness before he began writing, not confusion, but assembly. The way the entry point had come, not through the coordinate geometry directly, but through the vector algebra result he had worked out 6 months earlier and written in the back of his 3rd notebook. The way the proof had constructed itself once the entry point was established, each step following the last with the soundness of something built on correct foundations. Webb said the vector algebra result. Can you derive it for us? From the beginning. He looked at the whiteboard. Webb nodded. Elijah stood. He picked up the marker. He stood at the board for a moment, not performing a pause, just beginning where things actually began, which was always further back than most people expected. He wrote the initial setup. He stated the conditions cleanly. He moved through the derivation with the unhurried clarity of someone who is not recalling a memorized sequence but following a logic for whom the path is not stored, but regenerated each time from the principles that underlie it. Because the principles are what he owns, the rest being consequence. 8 minutes. He put the marker down. He looked at what he had written. Then he turned back to the table. Hayward had stopped writing on his legal pad. He was sitting very still, looking at the board with an expression between surprise and recognition, the look of someone who has seen a familiar landscape from an angle they had not encountered before and is recalibrating. He said the move in step 4. The substitution. Where does that come from? Elijah said, it's the natural move if you hold the magnitude constant and let the direction vary at that stage. The constraint resolves more cleanly that way. Hayward looked at the board. He said not quite to anyone. That is not the standard approach to this. I know, Elijah said. The standard approach works. This one is shorter. Hayward looked at him. Something in his expression shifted toward the family of expressions that includes a smile without quite being one. He said, walk me through why you prefer it. And Elijah walked him through it. Not as a student explaining to an examiner, as someone who has thought carefully about something and is sharing the thinking with another person who has the capacity to follow it, which is a different kind of conversation, one with a different rhythm and a different kind of exchange where both people are engaged at the level of the actual ideas rather than the level of the performance of knowing things. It went on this way for 40 minutes. Questions and answers that were not the questions and answers of assessment, but of genuine inquiry, people pulling at threads to see what held and what needed more asking. Not because they lacked the answer, but because they wanted to see the road Elijah had taken to reach it, what the view looked like from where he was standing. At the 40-minute mark, Okafor set down her pen. She looked at Elijah for a moment with the look of someone who has been searching for something for a long time and has found it in an unexpected place and is taking a moment not to process it, but to acknowledge it before moving to what comes next. She said, what do you want to do? Not what career, not what field, not what are your goals for the next 5 years with a degree and the right qualifications. Just what do you want to do? As if the question were that simple and that large at the same time. He had thought about this. He had not been asked it in this form before, in the present tense without a ceiling attached by someone sitting across from him who had read the work and understood what she was actually asking. He said, I want to do real mathematics. I want to work on problems that don't have answers yet. I want to see what's actually out there. He paused. Then I've been looking at the edge of what I can reach with what I have. I know there's more past it. I want to get there. Okafor looked at Hayward. Hayward looked at Webb. Something passed between them that required no words, the specific understanding of people who have reached the same conclusion by separate internal routes and are confirming it without the inefficiency of language. Then Okafor looked back at Elijah. She said, I'm going to give you something to work on. Not a problem with a known solution. An open question. Something at the frontier of current work. You'll have 2 weeks. She paused. I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm asking you to show me how you think about it. He said, all right, she said, this is not the final step. There are still processes, formal assessments, scholarship committees, administrative decisions. Those will happen. But before any of that, I need to see one thing. He waited. She said, I need to see whether you do this when no one is watching, when there is no examination paper and no clock and no one checking your progress, whether the mathematics is something you do or something you are. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. He picked it up. He read it. He read it again. It was a question in geometric analysis. Clean statement, deep structure. The kind of problem that looks bounded at the surface and opens into something much larger once you begin moving through it. He could see 3 possible entry points immediately. He could sense that 2 of them would close quickly and 1 would go somewhere. He could feel the shape of the territory beyond the viable entry point, the way you feel the shape of a dark room from the doorway, not seeing but sensing the quality of its depth. He looked up. She said 2 weeks. He folded the paper and put it in the front pocket of his backpack next to the mechanical pencil in its cloth wrapping. He said, I'll bring you 3 approaches. Hayward made a sound that contained a laugh without fully committing to one. Webb looked at the table and something at the corner of his mouth moved. Okafor said, then let's talk about how we make that happen. He did not tell his mother about the problem that evening. Not right away. He came home from the 2 buses and changed out of the school uniform and hung it carefully and ate dinner with Cecile while she talked about the morning shift. A difficult situation at the hospital reception desk that had required managing 4 things at the same time. The evening shift at the supermarket. A scheduling change that had created a conflict she was still working out. He listened, he asked questions, he was present the way she had always been present for him fully, without the part of his attention that was already on the problem pulling him away from the room they were actually in. After dinner, he helped clear the table. Then he said, "It went well." She turned from the sink. She looked at him with the attention she had given him every evening for as long as he could remember. He said, "They gave me a problem to work on. An open question. 2 weeks. I can see the entry point." She said, "Then what are you waiting for?" He went to his room. He opened the fourth notebook to the first blank page. He wrote the problem statement at the top in his careful handwriting. He sat with it. He thought about what Okafor had said, whether the mathematics is something you do or something you are. He had known the answer to this since the library carol at 13, the topology problem, the 4 days. The answer had never changed. The audience had never been the point. The recognition had never been the point. The point had always been the thing on the other side of the difficulty, the view from the far side of a problem that had resisted the satisfaction of following the logic wherever it led and arriving at something true. He picked up the pencil. He began. The 2 weeks moved the way time moves inside a problem. Not slowly and not quickly, but with the rhythm of deep work, which does not measure itself in hours, but in the distance between where you started and where you are in the questions that have resolved and the ones that have opened in their place in the territory, becoming gradually, incrementally more known. He went to school. He sat in the year 10 classes and worked through the assigned material in the fraction of the time it required and spent the remainder in the productive stillness of a mind engaged elsewhere. The problem running in the background, the way deep calculations run below the surface of the visible work. Drawing resources, making progress in the way that things make progress when you cannot see them but are moving toward them. He went to the library 4 times in the 14 days. He reserved the 30-minute session each time. He did not go overtime. He used what he had, which had always been the discipline underlying all the other disciplines. On the evening of the 9th day, he found the structure. Not the solution, the shape of the solution. The way the 3 entry points resolved 2 closing as he had predicted the 3rd opening into exactly the territory he had sensed from the doorway. Inside that territory was a relationship between 2 geometric properties that the problem statement implied without making explicit a relationship that once seen organized the problem's behavior, the way a key organizes a lock, not by forcing, but by fitting. He wrote it out, then wrote it out again by a different route to verify that the first route was not an artifact of how he had chosen to represent things. It was not. It was real. He worked through the 3rd approach, the one he had been least confident in, and followed it until it confirmed what the 2nd had shown. 3 paths to the same destination. He wrote for 2 hours in the notebook slowly with the care of someone who has finished thinking and is now communicating, transforming internal understanding into external language that someone else can follow. He wrote for himself first and for Okafor second, and tried as always to make those 2 things identical, which is the standard to which all good mathematical writing aspires. He sat back and looked at what he had written. The mathematics did not belong to him. This was something he had understood gradually over the past 2 years, and that had now arrived with the clarity of a thing finally fully known. It did not belong to anyone. It was in the structure of things present and waiting available to anyone willing to go far enough into the territory to find what was there. The work was not creation, it was discovery, and discovery was available to anyone willing to go far enough for long enough without requiring the going to be witnessed. He had been willing. He closed the notebook. On the 14th day, he took the 2 buses back to Hyde Park. He brought the 4th notebook. He sat across from Okafor in the same seminar room without Hayward and Webb this time, just the 2 of them, and the whiteboard and the morning light coming through the high windows at an angle different from the October angle of the examination room, but with the same quality of availability, of not being in a hurry, of being present for whatever was happening beneath it. He slid the notebook across the table. She read it. She read it the way a mathematician reads something that matters, which is to say, at the speed the argument requires, not faster following every step, rather than sampling, letting the work make its case on its own terms, rather than managing it from above. She read for 20 minutes while he sat and looked at the whiteboard and held the particular quality of calm that comes from having done the work and knowing it. Then she looked up. She said, "You found 3 approaches." He said, "You told me to bring 3. She said, "I told you to show me how you think about it." I did not expect 3 complete approaches. He said the third one is the cleanest, but the second shows more of the underlying structure. I thought you might want to see both. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to tell you something about the vector algebra result, the one you derived for question 12. He waited. She told him about the researcher in the UK, the narrow circulation journal paper published 3 years earlier. The result he had written in the back of his third notebook, worked out alone over 3 evenings, that had been found before by someone who had been looking for it in the context of a much larger proof about geometric structures. He took this in. He sat with it. She said, you didn't know. He said no. She said the road you took to get there was not his road. The approach was yours. And finding it at 15 alone without resources or guidance, without knowing anyone had looked for it, is not diminished because someone arrived before you. In some ways, it is more significant. It means the thinking was genuinely yours, not absorbed, built. He considered this. He said, so there are more things like that. Results that exist that I haven't found yet. Places in the territory that have been mapped but that I can get to on my own. She said, there are entire territories, Elijah. Most of mathematics is unmapped. What has been found is a fraction of what is waiting to be found. He looked at the whiteboard. She said, and some of what you find will be genuinely new, not independent rediscovery. First, the room was quiet. He said, then I need more access, more time, more resources. She said, yes, and that is what we are going to talk about today. What followed was not immediate. The scholarship committee met. The formal assessments were administered not because anyone who had spent time in a room with Elijah Morrow doubted his ability, but because the process required them, and there was no pathway around the process, only through it. He sat the assessments. He performed as he always performed when given questions worth answering. The process took 6 weeks. On the morning of the 60th day after the original examination, Bernard Pruitt was at his desk in his classroom. He had a coffee that had not yet gone cold, which was unusual. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it came at that hour, specific and unhurried. His phone rang. He answered. Dr. Okafor said, you were the first person who saw him. I thought you should know first. He sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended. He looked at the window. He looked at the empty room. He thought about 19 years in the accumulated weight of assumptions made and not examined, of attention given to some things and withheld from others, of ceilings drawn so quietly that no one had seen the drawing and everyone had accepted the ceiling himself, included himself first. He thought about the boy in the second row from the back, sitting with the wrong paper, picking up the pen without asking for permission, working through 12 questions of a university entrance examination with the calm of someone who had been doing this work alone for 2 years and was simply finally being asked to show it. He thought about how close the alternative had been, how he had almost taken the paper back, how Elijah could have sat the year 10 examination, completed it in 14 minutes, received an A and a comment about strong reasoning, and continued for 2 more years in a system that had decided what he was and would never have known it was wrong because no one would ever have thought to check. The closeness of that alternative was its own kind of lesson, one he intended to carry. He went back to his classroom in September. He kept a closer eye on the back rows. He asked different questions. He did not accept the early finish as evidence of mastery and move on. He sat beside the students who finished early and asked what they were thinking, what was easy and what was difficult, what they had been curious about that the lesson had not addressed. He paid attention to the answers the way attention is a skill that can be developed that had operated in him for too long at a level below what the work required. He did not find another Elijah Morrow, but he found 3 students working past the edges of what he had been teaching them. A girl who had been supplementing the textbook with online resources and had built independently a solid understanding of introductory statistics that the curriculum would not reach until the following spring. A boy with a folder on his phone full of geometry problems he was working through in his own time, without any expectation of acknowledgement, simply because the problems were there. A student in the front row who asked after a lesson on integration whether the technique had any connection to something she had encountered in a science article, and whose question, when Pruitt followed it, pointed to a connection that was entirely real and that had taken him a genuine moment to verify. He had been in the same room with these students for weeks. He had not seen them until he started looking. He started looking. The district published its report 8 weeks after Elijah's scholarship was confirmed. Privacy rules prevented it from naming him, but its findings were built from the pattern his case had made visible, the way a single thread, when pulled with care, reveals the entire structure of the fabric it belongs to. The report found that the district had no systematic mechanism for identifying high-ability students at under-resourced schools. That teacher expectations were calibrated to historical school-level performance rather than to national benchmarks, creating invisible ceilings that no individual had decided to draw, but that everyone was operating beneath. That the gap between what high-ability students received at well-resourced schools and what they received at under-resourced schools was not a gap in potential, but in visibility in the simple question of whether anyone thought to look. The report recommended formal links between state schools and university outreach programs, regular review of student progress against national benchmarks rather than only school-level expectations, training for teachers to identify ability that does not announce itself in the expected ways through the expected signals in the expected students. Pruitt had contributed to the report. He had sat across from the district administrator for 2 hours and answered every question without managing his answers for appearance, without omitting the parts that reflected poorly on his own practice. He said what he had done and what he had not done, and why and what it had cost, and what it might have cost if the paper had been retrieved and replaced, and Elijah Morrow had spent 2 more years invisible inside a system that had decided his ceiling and never thought to verify it. He said it because he understood that what had almost happened to Elijah was not exceptional. It was not an aberration in an otherwise functioning system. It was the ordinary consequence of a system running on defaults, processing students by probability, allocating attention by context, rather than evidence, drawing ceilings no one could see and everyone was living beneath. The report was not comfortable reading. It was not supposed to be. The morning Elijah's A-level results came out, he was standing outside the examination hall in the particular brightness of a summer morning that has not yet decided how hot the day will become, that holds itself in a luminous suspension before the heat arrives and changes the quality of everything. He had sat the A-level further mathematics examination 6 weeks earlier alongside students 2 years older than him. He had come to know 3 of them by name across the 2 exam papers. They had exchanged between sessions the specific wordless acknowledgement of people who have been through something difficult together and come out on the other side of it, not friends exactly, but fellow travelers, which is its own kind of recognition. The result was in the envelope. He had known going in what he was capable of. He had known the material not in the way you know material you have been taught, but in the way you know material you have lived with, argued with, disassembled, and rebuilt across seasons of your life, until it is less like something you carry and more like the structure of the way you think. He opened the envelope. He read the result. He stood very still for a moment, not for effect, just because stillness was the appropriate response to the particular weight of what he was holding. Then he took out his phone and called his mother. She answered on the second ring, which was how she always answered immediately, as if she had been expecting the call regardless of when it came. She was in the break room at the hospital between patients at the table that wobbled on one leg with the coffee that was not good but was hot. He told her the score. She was quiet, not the empty quiet, the full one. The quiet of someone who has been filled past their ordinary capacity and needs a moment before they can begin to speak. Not because they have nothing to say, but because there is too much and it requires a moment to find the beginning. He had learned over 16 years to tell the difference between these silences. He waited in this one the way you wait for someone who is arriving, not gone. Then she said, "Tell me what you learned." He laughed. Standing outside the examination hall on a summer morning in Chicago, 16 years old, scholarship in hand, result in the envelope, the territory ahead, vast and unmapped and genuinely available to him. Now he laughed. Not the performed laugh, the real one, the kind that comes from the specific relief of things having been worth exactly what they cost of the work, having meant what you believed it meant through all the days when no one else knew you believed it. He found a bench and sat down. The sun was on his face. The city was doing what it always did, moving through its morning without reference to what was happening on this particular bench, at this particular moment, which was, he had come to understand, the only way anything important ever happens. Without the world's permission. Without announcement. He said the third question. There was a technique they expected, and I found a cleaner approach, and I had about 30 seconds to decide whether to trust it. She said, and he said I trusted it. It was right. I knew it was right while I was still writing it. She said, tell me about the last question. He told her. The last question that had taken 7 minutes to open the entry point, concealed in an assumption the problem made that most students would not have thought to examine the restructuring that occurred once the assumption was identified, and set aside the clean resolution that followed the specific satisfaction of the final line written in the pen set down. She listened the way she always listened. She asked the questions that only someone who had been paying attention for 2 years of dinner table explanations could ask, questions that came from genuine engagement, from the edge of her own understanding, which was a different edge from his, but was still alive, still reaching, still the edge of a mind that had not stopped. They talked for 45 minutes. He had expected this moment to feel like an ending, like a resolution, like something that gathered all the years and all the work and all the particular details of this story. The library card, the notebooks, the wrong paper, the empty classroom. Pruitt's hand flat on the proof. Okafor's voice saying, there are entire territories, and resolve them into something complete and summarizable, a thing that had a shape you could hold. But it did not feel like that. It felt like a first page, like the blank page at the front of the 5th notebook, like the moment after you have found the entry point and can see for the first time the full extent of what lies beyond it, how large the territory actually is, how genuinely unmapped, how much of it is waiting for someone willing to go in. This was not the end of anything. This was what it felt like when the ceiling disappeared. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just gone. And in its place, the unobstructed view of what had always been there. He sat on the bench and talked to his mother and thought about the mathematics that was waiting on the other side of this morning. The problems with no solutions yet. The results that did not yet exist anywhere in any journal, in any notebook, in any mind. The roads not yet taken into territory, not yet named by anyone waiting for someone willing to follow the logic wherever it led past the maps, past the edge of what was known into the space where the real work begins. He was 16 years old. He had 4 notebooks full of working. He would need more. He was already sure of that. He was already looking forward to filling them.